right, let's work the 4-stitch creel right leaning. Now, anytime you're working the creel stitch with an even number of stitches, obviously you can't have a center creel stitch because it's an even number, there's no center stitch. So when you're working with even numbers, it either needs to lean to the right or to the left. Now you can also lean right and left with an odd number, but for even numbers, that's about your only option. So I'm going to show you the 4-stitch right leaning creel. And what we want to do is I'm going to cross my colors because I'm ready to work the next set. And I always keep my darker color over the top when I cross. That's just a little trick I keep in my head because then I never have to guess which one I'm supposed to cross which way. It's just always the darker color, or if they're similar, then the main color over the top. Okay, so I'm ready to work. I have my 4 stitches here. And to work the right leaning, I'm going to catch the float in the first stitch and then knit the next 3. And that's going to bring that float up at an angle. So I caught the float and now I'm going to knit 3. Oop. And now it's time for the next set. So I'm going to bring the white to the front, the dark berry to the back. And this little trick, you may have heard me say this before, but the way to make sure you are knitting with the right color at the right time is whichever color is on your left needle is the color of the working yarn you should be using. Now, this is true for basic creel. There are some variations that change that, but generally for most creel variations, if you are looking at a color here and it doesn't match the color on your working yarn, double check that you've wrapped correctly or you haven't missed anything. All right, so we're ready for the next one. I'm going to do the same thing I did before. I'm going to pick up the float, I'm going to catch it, and then I'm going to knit it with the first stitch, and that's how I get this right leaning. See how it draws it up to the right? You will see this reflected in the wheat shock cowl. That's a good example of how you would use a right leaning creel stitch over 4 stitches. All right, so we're starting to get a little growth. You can kind of see, but with any creel stitch knitting, it takes quite a few rows before you can see the pattern develop. So don't get discouraged early on. It takes a little bit of time. All right, we'll do it one more time. Oh, catch the float. So knit 1, catch float, and then knit the next 3. And that is how you work the 4-stitch creel right leaning. Now, something to keep in mind, the longer the floats are, the more of a challenge it is to keep them consistent and make sure they're not too loose or too tight. So when you're working your creel stitch, especially over 4 or 5 stitches, and especially when it's a right leaning instead of a center, when it pulls in the center, and if you're not familiar with the center creel, make sure you have a look at that video. I'll link it below. But when you do a center creel, it kind of evens out that distance of the float. But when you're doing a right leaning or a left leaning creel stitch, you're going to have more of that float exposed all in one span of stitches. Because of that, you really want to be cautious about your tension. Practice until you get some muscle memory going and really have a good sense that your tension is consistent. If these floats are sagging or drooping, they're a little bit too loose and you're going to want to try again. Now, I generally say it's hard to get them too loose. Most people err on the side of a little bit too tight, so I talk a lot about loose floats. However, as you're working with longer floats and especially in heavier weights of yarn, like this is a worsted weight, you will need to make sure you're not getting too loose. Notice how my floats, they're pretty consistent. When I rub over them, they're not really going anywhere. So they're kind of, they have a little bit of flexibility so the fabric can lay flat. And of course the top float looks longer because it hasn't been caught yet. But look at the ones that you have below and just make sure that they look flat and consistent and they're not sagging or drooping. If they are sagging or drooping, I recommend trying again and just holding a little more tension with your working yarn as you work those floats, and you'll get better results. So once you get going, you'll be able to see that pattern develop, but that is how you work the 4-stitch right leaning creel stitch.